With that, I'd like to proceed to the first presentation where I'm going to be talking about a portfolio analysis that I conducted with my colleagues Sharon McCarthy and Priyanka Tuovinen, looking at inclusion of economic outcomes in funded NCI grants. The goal of this portfolio analysis was to look at characteristics of NCI grants that included economic analyses. I want to make clear that information on funded NIH grants is public, so the information I'm going to be presented on funded NCI grants is all public information. The portfolio analysis used the NIH Query View Report, or QVR system, to identify competitively funded grants in the 2015 through 2020 period. Though we only had partial data on the 2020 period, that included economic analyses. We defined economic analyses in these grants as grants that included either economic outcomes, so grants that included cost effectiveness, or financial hardship, for example. Grants that included studies of the economics of cancer care delivery, or grants that included studies of the impacts of health economic policies, insurance, or healthcare reforms. The QVR system, which we used to search for grants that included economic outcomes, allowed us to search for text phrases in grant titles, abstracts, and specific aims, as well as looking at the NIH research, condition, and disease categorization, or RC terms in each grants. Our portfolio analysis search included 24 of these RCDC terms related to economic analysis, as well as 23 text phrases that we searched for in the grant titles, abstracts, and specific aims. This graphic illustrates the search and categorization process that we used for the portfolio analysis. We started with an iterative text search to begin to try to identify which funded NCI grants actually included economic analyses. We started very broadly and quickly learned that we needed to narrow down our search. For example, when we started with grants that included the word cost in their specific aims or abstracts, we found more than 1,000 grants that included the word cost. Many of them included sentences such as cancer is associated with substantial costs, but they did not include any sort of economic analysis. We learned quickly that we needed to narrow down the search terms that we used in order to find grants that actually included economic analyses. Once we narrowed down our search terms, we came up with appropriate terms and identified 149 grants that we then searched through. Each grant searched through by at least 2 members of the study team, and identified 102 grants that included economic outcomes. In reviewing the 149 grants, we also identified additional search text phrases and additional RCDC terms, conducted additional searches, and identified 12 additional grants for a total of 114 grants that included economic outcomes. One of these grants was an L30 award that was a loan repayment award, which we didn't feel was truly appropriate for this portfolio analysis, so excluded that and ended up with a total of 113 grants for this portfolio analysis. We then curated these 113 grants, categorizing the types of grants, the types of economic analyses, the types of studies that were performed. I'm going to be presenting results on a subset of these, of 86 of these grants that were the R grants, the R01, R21, or R3 grants, where we could in detail look at the types of scientific and economic analyses that were performed in these grants. So remember these 86 R grants that were included in the portfolio analysis. Before I get to those 86 R grants, I want to frame the 113 grants that we did find that included outcomes analysis within the entire portfolio of NCI funded grants. So thinking about just the grants that were funded between 2015 and 2019, where we knew the entire portfolio of NCI funded grants, among the grants that we identified that included economic analyses, funded 2015 through 2019, the grants that we identified represented slightly under 1%, 0.84% of all NCI grants. So let me put that another way. Among the new or competing renewal grants that are awarded by NCI between 2015 and 2019, 0.84% of those grants included economic analyses. Now, we hypothesized that R01 grants would be more likely to include economic analyses or economic outcomes. So looking at just those, we indeed found that among R01 grants awarded by NCI between 2015 and 2019, there was a threefold increase, about 2.25% included economic analyses. So looking at just the 86 R grants that we identified, first we looked at what area of the cancer continuum do they include. And these are non-exclusive cancer continuum areas. Grants may have included more than one area of the cancer continuum. We found that most grants included prevention and or screening. Fewer grants focused on treatment. Fewer still included survivorship or end of life. Among these 86 grants that included economic analysis, the vast majority included some type of cost effectiveness analysis. Almost 60 of the 86 R grants included some type of cost effectiveness analysis. The next most frequent type of economic analysis included in the grant was some other or unspecified cost analysis. Now, to explain that, we reviewed only the abstract and specific aims of the grants. We didn't review the entire grant, the body of the grant. And in the abstract or specific aim, a fair number of the grants specified only that they would be looking at costs associated with some aspect of cancer care or some cancer intervention. They did not specify what those costs were or what those costs included. We therefore categorize that as other or unspecified costs. A smaller number of grants actually specified that they would be looking at medical care costs or patient costs. Fewer grants included specifications that they were going to examine financial hardship, policy impacts, or other kinds of financial outcomes. Looking at the study type, most of the grants were interventional randomized controlled trials, RCTs. Fewer were simulations or models, prospective observational studies that didn't involve interventions, retrospective or other types of interventions. Looking at the relationship of the economic analysis with the study type, we saw some interesting findings. That in grants that involved either interventional RCTs or simulations or models, a majority of those grants included cost effectiveness analyses and or unspecified cost analyses. However, grants that involved retrospective studies, a majority of those involved evaluations of policy impacts. While grants that involved prospective observational studies, a majority of those included studies of financial hardship. So there's clearly a relationship between study type and the kind of economic outcome that's being studied within the grant. I just want to briefly mention the reviewing study section. Many of the identified grants were reviewed by the Health Services Organization and Delivery, or HSOD study section. As many people may know, the HSOD study section has ended. There are two new study sections that have been created: Health Services Quality and Effectiveness, and the Organization and Delivery of Health Services study section. Information on those study sections is available at that link. So in conclusion, only a small proportion of funded NCI grants discuss economic outcomes in either their abstracts or specific aims. Interestingly, the perspective of the economic outcome analysis was rarely mentioned in either the abstract or the specific aims. Most grants, including economic analyses, focused on prevention screening. Fewer address cancer treatment or survivorship. Now, while representing a relatively small proportion of all funded NCI grants, the NCI portfolio of funded grants, including economic analyses, is diverse, covers a range of cancer types, study designs, and economic analyses. With that, I'll thank you again for attending the conference and turn the podium over to my colleague, Amy Davidoff.